For this I have chosen really simple shapes, and you can see how quickly I can draw out the shape of this shell, just a swirl, and then the last edges have points to them. You can then fill with water the first space that you want to paint, and the water with watercolour will do all the work for you. So when you choose your colour and fill up your space, it'll move to where the water is. You can leave parts without any colour or any water at all for highlights later on. But basically, if you just smooth your paint into these spaces, it'll move to where you've wet the paper. And this is called the wet on wet technique. And I've allowed it to dry a tiny bit before I start adding details such as darker spaces to create the ridges on my shell, to make it look like the points are sticking out towards you, and the darker shadows on the center part, which means that you can see that it's actually a swirl. And you keep adding shadows, highlights and little details, and I'm using 3 different shades of blue and a grey colour here, and eventually it starts to look like it's popping off the page towards you. This turtle is going to have minor amounts of detail in the drawing because most of it's going to come from the colours I'm using and the way I'm going to layer them. So this turtle is going to have some blues and purples, and first of all I'm just filling in some of the spaces with a simple wash. So as before with the purple, I used a wet space, and now I'm using quite a wet brush to move the blues in the sort of shell pattern that the turtles have actually all over their legs as well as on their shells. So I'm picking out different pieces of blue and just filling in patches. And whilst my brush is quite wet, it's slightly less wet than for filling a large space because I want the differences in the colours to show. Now that I'm working on the shell, I've drawn out these areas that I want to have the colour in, and I'm putting in a tiny bit of one and a tiny bit of another colour and allowing them to merge together in my wet space. So I paint it wet, add the blue, and then add in the purple colour. And I want it to just have this kind of gradient within each space on the shell so that it looks interesting and colourful, and it celebrates the medium that's watercolour. So once I've let that dry for a while, I come back in and do some detailing. If I do the detailing when it's still wet, things like the eye will merge into the space around, and I won't be able to do these heavier parts which give it some depth and a little bit more sort of light and shadow and start making it look a bit more rounded. I'm going to put a few more details on the shell because I find the starkness of the white around those gradients a little bit difficult and a little bit unnatural. And then I'm going to gradually add in these bubbles, and the only thing I'm doing is painting a wet circle but just leaving a tiny bit of light on each one, and as you can see them gathering, they look like they are really round. The last shape I'm going to do is the simplest of all. You don't even need to do a sketch if you don't want to. I'm starting with a cloudy shape and filling it with different shades of blue and making sure that I leave some spaces with no water and no paint in for the highlights later on. So I'm darkening the edges to give it a little bit more form, and I'm letting the paint dry as I do these areas underneath. And you can probably guess that it's a jellyfish. So I'm adding in layers of light and dark and making it look a little bit more rounded. And as I darken the edges a little and give it some of those lines coming through it, you can see that it makes it look more and more 3D as I go. So the texture with the darker blue is giving it a little bit more depth. And then I have to let it dry because I'm going to add in these stronger lines now. And so I've let it go until I can paint without smudging now. And I'm just making sure that they go down those big tentacles at the back and they kind of peek out from behind. I'm adding in a little bit more depth across my dry top part of my jellyfish, and there we go. Very simple.